affordable units at 421 East Coda, and we have a review of the recommended budget for the city for fiscal year 2009. So let us start with item 1. And Mr. Pearson, who's going to lead off on this one?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the Finance Committee. Simon Kiefer will take this item.
All right, Simon, proceed.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the Finance Committee. I bring you a request from Transition House for a $100,000 pre-development loan, which will be used to pay for architectural services as Transition House plans to build new affordable units at 421 East Coda Street. This is the site of the old Mom's restaurant, and it's part of a larger parcel that the agency helped Transition House acquire back in 1999. It includes 425 East Coda next door. The Transition House plans have 3 components. They're going to build 8 new units. This will be permanent rental housing for their formerly homeless clients, people that have gone through their Transition House programs of job training and transitional housing. The second component would be on the ground floor would be a brand new infant daycare center. And then the third component is minor rehabilitation of existing affordable housing that's in a mixed-use building next door at 425 East Coda Street. So those 3 components, this really constitutes a final piece of the Transition House campus. And this has been a campus that's been developing over the years. I mean, just to take you back a little bit, they started with that small shelter building on Ortega Street, and that housed everything. It was their shelter, there was their offices, and their program space. And then they acquired 421, 425 East Coda Street, and they were able to move their offices and their program space out of the shelter building into 425 East Coda Street because that was a building in good shape and ready to go. And then they had 6 units of affordable housing up above that. And then they've been land banking 421 East Coda in the meantime. Now they're ready to go, and the timing is really good because it's going to coincide with what the Housing Authority is planning to do across the street at the Hagen printing site. And we're hoping that we can have these 2 sites be developed as jointly as possible. They've hired the same architect to start with here. They're going to be using the Housing Authority to manage the construction of the project, and they may even be able to bid these 2 jobs out together. The Housing Authority is planning to build housing for the chronic homeless, so the tenants in that new building on the Hagen printing site will be able to use the services that Transition House and programs that they offer across the street. The proposed loan, Transition House is requesting $100,000 to cover the architectural services. We'd be tailoring this to the pre-development stage of this project. For the first 2 years, it would have no interest, there'd be no payments. And then at the start of that 3rd year, the loan would become fully amortized, 3% interest, paid in 10 years. But well before that 3rd year, we're expecting that Transition House is going to conclude the pre-development. They're going to have a project. They're going to request that the pre-development loan be rolled into a permanent loan that they'll be coming back to us for. And so we're expecting that they're going to come back for an additional $700,000. So with this $100,000, that would be $800,000 for the 8 units. And that would be $100,000 per unit, which is pretty comparable to other recent projects we've seen. The proposed loan would be secured in 3rd position. This would be behind an existing $650,000 loan that's in place from Santa Barbara Bank and Trust and a $450,000 loan from the agency. So this is for that whole 421, 425 East Coda. Since that whole property is appraised at $5.3 million, we'll all be very well secured here. And Transition House is also then looking to go forward, looking for tax credits for the new project. They'd be going for the 4% credits, and they'd be looking to go for the state supportive housing program funds as well. It's appropriate that we use home funds here. We have a sufficient amount. For 2008, we've accumulated $1.1 million, which would be enough to cover what they need for pre-development and for the permanent loan, the $800,000 altogether. And we don't anticipate anyone else coming to us for home funds in the near future. It's also appropriate that we use home funds here because Transition House is a community housing development organization, which is they're a nonprofit that meets certain criteria that HUD has established for nonprofits, and we have to spend 15% of our home funds on SHODOs every year, so we'd be able to meet that requirement. However, home money can only be used for building affordable housing, so Transition House is prepared to go elsewhere then for what they're going to need to build the infant daycare center. So in conclusion, I request that the Finance Committee recommend to Council approval of the $100,000 pre-development loan. And we have Kathleen Bauschke here from Transition House, and Frank Thompson as consultant, and Skip Szymanski from the Housing Authority, if you have any questions. Thank you.
I am been involved in child care for a long time and still am, and I was wondering on the infant daycare center, which was accommodate 25 infants, my recollection of the economics in daycare facilities is that it takes more like about 40 to make it work in terms of the revenues and so on like that, or are we trying to structure this with either no or very low revenues? Can someone explain that to me?
Yes. We currently operate an infant care center for 12 babies, and we sustain that through private donations and some income through CalWorks sources. We believe that we'll be able to sustain a 25-unit or 25-baby infant care center by using the same sources for operating. It's possible that we could have a few slots in that center that are used by market rate babies and market rate babies, babies paying market rates, and that could generate some revenue that would help underwrite the cost of running the center.
So there will be no like pre-kindergarten age in here. It's all toddler.
It's 6 weeks to 2 years.
Yeah. Okay, great. And then, is there no other existing or outstanding loans on any of this facility? You mentioned its value, but you didn't say if there's any existing loans.
Yes, Mr. Chair. There are two existing loans. We have a $650,000 loan from Santa Barbara Bank and Trust,
Right.
and then the agency loan of $450,000.
So that's all there is?
That's all there is.
No, nothing else. Okay. Mr. Schneider?
Thanks. Gee, let me think about this. A couple of questions. One is the timing of and how it interacts with the Hagen printing. They're two very different projects, although I definitely see the value of working together and creating different services and housing right across the street from each other. But if you could comment on the timing, how both of them are moving forward, or what happens if one is moving faster than the other and how that works.
I'll tell you about our project and then let Skip speak to the same question. Transition House has definitely hired the Housing Authority to work as a partner with us on developing our project. No matter what the timing is, that will not change. We've also both hired the same architects so that they have sensitivity to what's going on with the other project, and that also will not change. The variable in this is the funding. We're each seeking our own funding, and the sources are different for our own projects. So the timing is going to be dependent on when each entity can raise the funds that we need to move forward. We're in the very beginning of our process. We're coming to you for development money so that we can get our architects going to be able to do the work that they need to do so that we can raise the rest of the money. Housing Authority is a little farther along than we are, and I'll let Skip tell you about that.
Okay.
The Housing Authority should be able to break ground September of 2009,
Oh, wow.
late 2009. We have the current tenants that are in there and have commitments with them to stay there. But as the process goes through the city, we've scheduled it out, and that's about the time that we should be done with all of our processes and with construction plans. There would be an economy of scale to have the construction of both projects go together at the same time, But if they don't, given the current economic situation, we anticipate construction costs would be coming down anyway. We feel they could be run separately and still get a very good project for both.
And on the city side of the permitting and review process, I mean, it seems to me it would make so much more sense to look at this completely on both sides. I mean, as it goes through ABR, I mean, how does that, are they going to go through ABR and the Planning Commission as two separate projects, or are going to be try to look at them together? Because I would imagine at least the Planning Commission might want to see how, I mean, I know we're talking just about a pre-development loan, but I'm just, as we move forward, there's economies of scale as we move forward here too. And I don't know if that's a staff, if that maybe that's something someone can get back to me on from the planning part, or Mr. Gustafson, if you have a sense of how that could work, because I could see that as a huge savings on all sides.
Thank you, Member Schneider. We hadn't really thought too much about that. We'll take a look at how they could be coordinated to the degree possible. We wouldn't want to delay the one
Right.
project, but and certainly when we're going through the review process, what we know about the one project will be provided to the decision-making bodies to help them understand how they coordinate.
Okay, because the mom's property is not changing the outside very much, or is it? Is it rearranging a little bit, or am I?
There are a couple of things to consider with that. One is the current condition of the existing building, and then the other is a potential designation as a historical landmark.
Right.
And we have to move through that process
Okay.
to see what we can and can't do. It's certainly the desire of our agency to preserve what we can of the existing facade and front part of the structure.
Great. Okay. Well, I can't think of a better team than Transition House and the Housing Authority working together in this, and having Frank Thompson involved as well. And I know the architects involved, and I think this is a great way to pool our resources together. So this is a no-brainer for me. So I'm happy to move it to council.
All right, was that a motion?
Sure.
Well, then I'll have to second that, I guess. And all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Thank you very much.
You can quote me in your fundraising. A no-brainer. No-brainer. Sorry. I don't think my mic was on.
Okay, item number 2 today is a review of the recommended budget for fiscal year 2009, and I will turn that over to Mr. Pearson.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. We're here to continue discussion on the recommended 2009 fiscal year 2009 budget. And today we really wanted to just sort of give you some sort of an assortment of miscellaneous information on the general fund budget, different ways of looking at it. And I think and hope that the information that we provide you today will help frame some questions that we can then go over at future meetings. So with that, Bob is my Vanna White today. What I just handed out, and we'll look on the screen now. I'm going to focus briefly on the top half, but most of my time on this piece of paper is going to be spent on the bottom half. And hold on just a sec. I think if we can zoom that, Bob. Yeah, but blow it up. There we go. Excellent. And just focus in on the top part. Thank you, Bob. Perfect. You will recall, I think, that this schedule summarizes the recommended adjustments to the fiscal year 09 recommended budget. And they are broken out into two categories. The top half represents the departmental adjustments, and the bottom half represents what we're referring to as other adjustments. And those are adjustments, as we'll see, that don't necessarily affect any individual department. And each of those two categories are broken down into one-time and ongoing. And so just real briefly on, we'll talk a little bit more about this later. On the top half, on the departmental adjustments, you can see that the one-time total was $569,000. The ongoing total is $1,743,000 for total departmental adjustments of some $2.3 million. And then on the departmental side, by department, you can see that it does range all the way from as low as almost $10,000 up to just over $750,000, $750,000. Again, I think I'll move to the bottom half of the schedule and spend some time because I'd like to go over for you each one of these in a little bit of detail to make sure that we all are understanding what is being proposed here and what each of these other quote-unquote adjustments represents. The first one is labeled Public Works ICS Rate Freeze, and ICS stands for Intra-City Services Fund. And you can see that there are proposed one-time adjustments of $75,000, ongoing adjustments of $133,000 for a total of $208,000. And the Public Works intra-city services are basically building maintenance and motor pool. And basically, as part of the budget balancing strategy, staff from the Public Works Department was instructed to freeze their rates that they charge to other city operations, the general fund included, for fiscal year 09, and it was a way of ensuring that that all of the services and activities that the general fund provides and are provided to the general fund share in the adjustments that are being required as a result of our revised revenue estimates. And so $208,000 is been saved as compared to what the second year of the two-year plan was when we adopted it a year ago, because that plan included a provision for rate increases on the Public Works ICS charges. And as it turns out, as we came through and did the revisions, we're freezing those rates. And so we were able to lower departmental budgets across the board in the general fund by a cumulative total of $208,000. Now, I stress that this does not affect the services that the general fund departments are going to receive from the internal service funds. There may be some minor tweaking around the edges, but essentially it's the same level of service. We're just not allowing them to recoup a CPI rate increase and really requiring our internal service activities to absorb that CPI rate increase for a year.
Yet, to ask for a CPI means that there were expenses they expected to incur. So obviously they expected to have expenses.
That's absolutely right.
So are we saying there's not going to be expenses then?
Well, no, they're like everyone else. They're going to have to tighten their belt for a year, and they're going to have to find creative ways to absorb the reduction in the reduction of the revenue increase that they would have anticipated. So what this really represents is that they would have gotten a $208,000 revenue increase next year to cover those, yes, CPI type cost increases. They're not going to get that, and they're going to have to, for at least 1 year, they're going to have to find a creative way to, just like the general fund departments, to save money and to try to provide the same level of service with a little less money. I would hasten to add that the percentage hit that this represents on the internal service funds from Public Works is a very small percentage.
Yeah, I'm just making a point that if there wasn't any impact at all, then they wouldn't need the increase in the first place.
That's absolutely right. No, you're absolutely right.
Okay.
And I want to encourage Bob or Jim to jump in at any time if they want to comment on any of these. The second one in the list is very similar. It's another internal service fund. It's our information systems internal service fund. It's not Public Works. That's why it's shown separately. It's part of the Administrative Services Department. And in this case, we didn't freeze their rates. We reduced the amount of increase that they are getting. So they had actually planned in the second year of the two-year plan to get a rate increase, as I recall, of something over 7%. And we knocked that back to about 3.5%. So they're still getting a CPI increase. It's just that they had actually planned to raise rates even a little more to accomplish some other things that they may just simply have to defer for a year.
And I would just add on that, we were trying to beef up the information services operation because we become so dependent on information systems, and that's why we had actually programmed a little larger increase there. and we just decided, based upon the overall economics, we couldn't afford that. So, and you will also be seeing, when we do the administrative adjustments, we are going to be coming in and making a request to supplement their budget to do some one-time things, air conditioning systems, some uninterrupted power supply items that we need to do next year. So that'll be a one-time hit out of their fund balance, basically out of savings they've generated over the last couple of years.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Sawyer?
Question on information systems. I know we have a schedule of upgrading all the computers throughout citywide. I mean, that's a significant purchase order. So is that being stretched out as well, or is that schedule still being upheld?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Schneider, that program, if you will, is not being affected.
Okay.
The replacement cycle for both desktop computers and network servers and the infrastructure that go behind all of that, my understanding is that is not going to be affected.
I would put that down lower on the priority list, just because, just like deferred maintenance, you don't want to get too far behind, because then otherwise we can't keep up with technology and it becomes more expensive later. But
that's absolutely
just
right.
wanted to. I guess if we had to, we could slow it down, but we don't have to, it looks like, so far.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
That's correct. The next one on this list, in fact, the next two, are really part of an extremely positive development. And it's a development that we've been enjoying, fortunately, for the last 2 or 3 years. And that is that, as you know, the city is self-insured for workers' compensation insurance. And so while we have an umbrella policy that kicks in above a certain level, we're self-insured for a significant amount of money per workers' comp claim. And so when we have the good fortune and the good management to be able to control our workers' comp costs, obviously I like to say first and foremost, if workers' comp claim costs are down, probably the most important conclusion you can draw from that is that less city employees are getting injured on the job, and that means less loss of productivity. And obviously nobody likes to see employees get hurt on the job, so that's just in and of itself a good thing. But if there's as a finance guy, if there's a really good side benefit to that, it's that we save a lot of money as well. And over the last several years, our workers' comp claim costs have gone down fairly dramatically and on a sustained basis. Now, I can't promise you that it'll always be that way. My experience professionally over 2 decades with this city is that they tend to go in cycles, and that we will certainly at some point in the future see a rise again. But for the time being, I think through some active management as well as changes in state law and the like, we've really done a good job in controlling our workers' comp claim costs. And what that has allowed us to do is to reduce the premiums, essentially, that we charge all departments and funds for their workers' comp coverage. And you may recall that as part of the 2-year financial plan we adopted last June, we had actually lowered workers' comp rates by $750,000 citywide in each of the 2 years. And so we'd already taken some of that bonus, if you will, or that dividend. But here we are a year later, and the trend is still holding, and in fact even looking slightly better. And so we feel that we are able to go in at this point and further reduce the workers' comp premium charges at this time. And it was really another $250,000 in total, $160,000 of which accrues to the benefit of the general fund.
Could I just clarify the way this table is laid out a little bit? For those that haven't seen the preliminary information or the prior information, what we're saying is that we had a 2-year fiscal plan, and we're revising from that for items that we're attempting to reduce. But without, you don't really know what the base is, the way this table is laid out. So it's hard to know what percentage we're talking about here.
That's correct, Mr. Chair, and forgive me, sometimes I still forget that maybe these days a little bit more background is warranted before diving into the details with which most of us sitting at this table are very familiar with. So, but that's absolutely right, Mr. Chair. We're talking about the budget for next year, and the fact that because we had to lower revenue estimates, that we had to make some adjustments to rebalance the budget. And these are some of the adjustments that we are proposing to the council to accomplish that, to rebalance the budget. And I think that this group of adjustments are adjustments that don't arise out of any one particular department. They're not what we refer to as departmental adjustments, where we ask a department, or all departments for that matter, to revise their own budgets downward to save money. These are things we're able to identify citywide or general fund wide that would affect all departments, but they're really things like allocated costs and one time, for the most part. You can see that the majority of them, almost 1.4 million, are one time in nature. And so those are the things we're discussing, is ways that we were able to identify chunks of money within the budget that we could reduce to help close the gap, which would then leave us with a less intimidating number to that we had to ask of departments in terms of departmental adjustments.
Let me just say for the record that Ms. Falcone has been at another meeting and is joining us, and that we are just beginning our review of the budget adjustments at this time. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I apologize for being late. My other meeting did run long.
Not a problem. Okay, Bob.
So,
proceed.
we continue. I just wanted to say a few more things about the workers' comp rate reduction, and that is that it is a citywide adjustment of, as I mentioned, $250,000. And it looks like that we're, 9 or 10 months through the current fiscal year. We're still on track for our continued good results in our workers' compensation program. So that's encouraging. And that leads me to the next one, which is the use of the Risk Management Fund reserves of $801,000. And what had happened was, because the workers' comp results came on us so quickly over the last 2 or 3 years, the improvement in our workers' comp experience, it turns out that the premiums we had been charging to our funds and departments for their workers' comp coverage, in retrospect, the premiums we'd been charging turned out to recover more money than had been needed to fund the workers' comp program. And so what ended up happening was the Risk Management Fund, it's a separate fund, it's our own little insurance fund, ended up accumulating reserves above the level of reserves required by our actuarial valuation of our outstanding and open claims, and to the point where we expect to end this fiscal year with reserves above the requirements, actuarially determined requirements, of as much as $2 million. And so we'll have fully funded actuarial reserves, and that's about $8.5 million in cash sitting in that fund, and that's what the actuary says we should have in the bank to cover the open claims we have and what they call IBNR, which is incurred but not reported claims. And so we decided that, essentially, like insurance companies do sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, if you have what's called a retrospectively rated policy, they go back after the policy period is over, and if they determine that they charged you too much in premiums, they'll actually rebate you a portion. And that's essentially what we're doing here. We're looking back over the period of the last 2 or 3 years and saying that the Risk Management Fund, in retrospect, recovered more in premium dollars than they needed. It sat in their reserves, which was above what was required. And so at this point, we are taking $1,250,000 of those reserves and rebating them to the city's funds and departments across the city. The general fund's portion of that is just over $801,000, which is a large sum of money. And obviously that goes a long way towards, that's a significant item in terms of helping us meet our budget balancing. Yes, exactly. So
it's 20% of the whole general fund adjustment we're looking at.
That's
right?
about right.
About a
Yep.
$4 million. Yeah.
That's right.
Mr. Chair, how much again, Mr. Pearson, was the entire amount that you were rebating back to the city?
The citywide amount is $1,250,000, 1.25 million. And what we did was we took that 1.25 million and
I understand you split it up between various different enterprise
based
funds and the
on
general
workers'
fund.
comp premiums charged.
All right, so it's proportionally rebated back.
That's correct.
Is that necessary?
It's, in my opinion, it's appropriate that that the premium rebate, if you will, is calculated in a manner that reflects the way those premium dollars were generated in the first place? Are we legally required? Absolutely not.
Okay, therein lies my question. If we're not legally required, although I know that Mr. Armstrong likes to do cuts across the board so that it's shared pain and it's shared equality, there's a certain equilibrium to that, and that's, all things being equal, that's terrific. However, in certain circumstances, when we are looking at substantial cuts in public safety, which is a high priority for the community, I'm wondering whether or not we don't look at the total sum and maybe make some policy decisions about where we would actually rather have the money go, although it may be fair and equitable to do it exactly the way that you have done it and that Mr. Armstrong has instructed. However, it may be the will of this board, of the council, of the community to allocate the funds slightly differently, since there is $1.2 million augmenting the $800,000 you already have done. Just your thoughts.
Let me make a couple of comments. First, we have not allocated cuts across the board, just so it's clear. We based on what we think are the council's priorities in terms of the adjustments. But more importantly, I think this is a slippery slope. When you collect premiums from the waterfront and the airport and the wastewater operation and the water operation for workers, for employees, and then you've over-collected basically, not intentionally, but you basically have assessed them premiums and then you have a rebate. I think you have to be really careful about then transferring that money back and saying, let's put it all back in the general fund. And I think it's a real slippery slope. I think probably legally you can do it, but I think you need to be very careful. It pained me to make rebates to the enterprise operations. I would have preferred that it all go to the general fund, and we discussed this. I think we have to be really careful, and because it's those were paid, and we assessed, in most cases we assessed the ratepayers. And I think you have to be really careful, both from a, kind of just what's the proper thing to do, but there may even be some legal constraints, although the dollar amount in the scheme of things may be relatively minor to those other operations, and that's the caution I'd have. And
when I say that the across-the-board cuts are egalitarian and so forth, I meant that with all due respect and all compliments, and just that that's a general philosophy that I know you operate under, except that we have spoken fairly clearly over the last number of years and said that public safety is a high priority, and I know you respect that, and didn't really do that this time, and I know that's appreciated by me. I won't speak for other people, but I recognize that. I was just saying that that's a general philosophy. And I would agree with you that it's a slippery slope when you collect fees from one, particularly an enterprise fund, and you start then distributing. If public safety were not departments, both police and fire, were not departments that actually served the waterfront or served the airport or served these various different enterprise funds, then I would say, well, maybe, that argument has a stronger foothold, but everybody gets served by the same police department. Everybody gets served by the same fire department. So I think that the nexus can be made. So I'm just wondering whether or not anybody else would like to have that discussion a little more fully.
Well, as far as I understand, today you're reviewing with us the outline as far as how it looks, and then I don't know whether we're going to have time today to get into a discussion of policy and where the cuts will be taken and things like that. I know you have a fairly extensive agenda today to cover.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I think it was staff's intent to, that's the reason we're here going over these is to make sure that.
I just raise it.
Yes, absolutely, and that's clearly what we're here for, is to explain these to you, make sure you understand them, to get a sense of your comments and your preliminary thoughts, and then to return to you for a more detailed discussion of how these might be, if at all, revised, or what kind of recommendations
Right.
this
That
committee
was my
would like
understanding
to
of-
make to the full council.
Yeah.
Of course, we're glad to answer any questions. We take notes on everything you say, and we make sure that we close the loop with you at some point in the future. Clearly, as you know, from a process standpoint, this committee, the Finance Committee, will, as usual, as always, be concluding your discussions and your review of the budget with a series of recommendations to the full council. And we expect that your purview over these items will include everything on all of these schedules that we're going over today.
Right. I would also, I think my suggestion would be to keep a running list, and this being the first of probably many, because doing one thing out of context might be a little difficult. For example, I mean, just sort of, if we just, in this particular case, thinking, well, okay, let's look at the waterfront department. How does that relate to Harbor Patrol in terms of that money back to the waterfront department? Or are we not talking about the waterfront department because they have a patrol and they, So, I mean, there are all these questions before we make determinations. And also, I think later, as we get into the schedule of what things we want to look at, how other agencies might then impact our public safety and infrastructure and parks and recreation, then I think we'll have a clearer picture. But this is certainly one of the items we can keep on the list.
The other thing I want to point out is at the top of this page that we're looking at contains the general funded departments. And so people are able to see the projections here. I don't know whether you're going to touch on that later on.
Well, actually, we had planned primarily to focus today.
I understand that, but the numbers are there, so we need to address
Yeah.
Mr. Chair?
the scope. Yeah.
And just to, because I know there's been some publicity about just the overall numbers that are being cut in each department, but I just want to say out on TV land or whatever that, and we'll get details from each department about what those cuts entail, but my understanding from the list is that in terms of public safety, we're not eliminating any positions. There's no patrol being lost. It's more dealing with other issues related to equipment, or, I mean, not to say that it won't have an impact. Of course it will, and we're going to talk about that. But just to get it out there that the big number under police, for example, is $767,000, does not equate to lost staff. In fact, we're staying fully staffed.
That's absolutely right, and I would stress that that is particularly true when you're talking about sworn positions, i.e. policemen and firemen, fire persons and police persons, patrol officers and firefighters. There we go.
Well done.
Thank you.
The people in uniform you see out there when you
That's
call
correct.
911. How's
Just
that? Okay.
in the interests of total disclosure, the police department is proposing the elimination of one vacant clerical position. It's a non-sworn position. It's an office position. It's not a patrol wearing a badge and a gun position.
And that we think they can do because of the implementation of the new records management system.
And that was something we had talked about months ago anyway when we authorized the funding for that new system, right? Okay.
Yeah, this is one additional position in addition to what they already had projected based upon what they believe, and then we'll reassess it at the end of the year and make sure we're okay that way.
The point is that since we are now publicly covered, when we put something out like this, we need to explain to the people what we're doing and not just leave the number there and not discuss it. So that's why I was bringing up the point.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. The next one down on the other adjustments.
Bob, I want to just interrupt
Go
one
ahead,
other.
sir.
I also want to make clear what Bob said on the workers' comp, that based on last year's actuarial review of the insurance fund, that's both liability and workers' comp, we have a net positive of $2.5 million. And so what we propose in this is to rebate back on a one-time basis $1.5 million of that, or $1.25 million, and retain that additional $1.25 million because of what Bob said about the workers' comp, especially more than liability, going up and down. So there's still a cushion in there in case we get hit with some big claims or all of a sudden our frequency goes up. We didn't think it was prudent to take the full 2.5.
And excuse me, just to flog that dying horse one more time, and that is that we are due to have an updated actuarial valuation on the risk management fund as of this June 30th. So that last time we had one done, the number changed. What the actuary said we should have in reserves changed, and it actually went down, and that freed up a bunch of money because we had the prior money in the bank. But the $2.5 million that Mr. Armstrong mentioned also includes a projection for the results of the current fiscal year, which we're now, 10 months through. So there is still some wiggle room in that number. It's not money in the bank, all of it, quite yet. So the next one is the use of street sweeping fund reserves of $500,000, $500,000. Now, you may recall that there was a time that that the street activities were part of the general fund, and essentially street sweeping, as you know, the bulk of the revenue from the street sweeping fund that supports street sweeping from citations issued as a result of people not clearing their cars out of the street sweeping way on the street sweeping day. And as we, over the early point of time, the amount of citations actually generated was in excess of the cost of running the street sweeping program. And in part that was anticipated because we knew that as we expanded the street sweeping program into other areas of the city, that eventually the costs of the street sweeping would balance with the revenues being generated from the citations. And we knew that would take time. It would mature, if you will, over time. And I think we've kind of reached that point now, or very soon will. But in the early times, there was a revenue surplus. And at this point, we feel, since parking citation revenue in many ways is a general fund revenue, the bulk of parking citation revenue is general fund revenue, we thought it was appropriate to go to the street sweeping fund and rebate back to the general fund the accumulated revenues and reserves from the early years of the citation revenue from the street sweeping fund. So that number is $500,000. It still leaves a small amount of money in the fund in reserves, and we believe that the street sweeping fund is in balance now, and that we're on an equilibrium, as I said.
Ms. Falcone?
Just refresh my memory. When we started this program 6 years ago, or whatever that was, the promise to the people was that we would eventually sweep the entire city, with the exception of some of the hilly areas in the Riviera with the very small, narrow streets, such as the one that Mr. Horton lives on, that we were never anticipating getting up into those nooks and crannies, but that except for those inaccessible areas by the machines, that we would be sweeping the entire city. Has that been accomplished to date?
No, the last phase will go into effect this July, and in fact we'll be coming to council with a status report in May. And I believe that that's in San Roque, Bel Air Knolls, some of the outlying areas, all of which will not have, I don't expect will have citation process. We won't be issuing citations. So that's what's happened is we started with the areas where we had the most number of cars on the street and the greatest amount of debris, where we issued a lot of citations. And as we've expanded outward, we're now into areas where there aren't a lot of citations. So, but the last phase will be implemented July 1st, and then we'll pretty much have met our commitment. And this is based on a plan we provided to the council and you approved, I think, about 3 years ago.
Yes, the final implementation plan, I think, was about that time. There are two areas, one that I described, which is hilly and very narrow and, for all intents and purposes, inaccessible for the machines. There's also another type of area that we are not planning on sweeping, and those are areas that have no sidewalks, that are sort of boulevard-y, if you will. Is that correct?
I'm not sure on the details, but I think it's where we don't have curbs and gutters, not where we don't have sidewalks.
Oh, I misspoke. Curbs and gutters. What's the difference?
Well, you can have an area, for example,
Alston?
I'm not sure if they have curbs and gutters there or not, but I think the issue is when you don't have curbs and gutters, then you can't collect the debris. It just pushes it aside. So
It pushes it into the yard,
Yeah.
as it were, and we don't want to push debris into people's yards necessarily, or up against their stone walls, I suppose. But all right, so there are a couple of places, although we're going to be sweeping the entire city, there are a few exceptions out of that we need to note. Okay, great. And even with that commitment having been met, we're going to be $500,000 in the green, in the black. So I know that the Creeks Division has always committed to helping with this program. Are they going to be rebated? Is their commitment going to be expected to continue? How does that work?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, the answer on the Creeks thing is that their support of the street sweeping program, which I believe is $125,000, $150, yeah, is going to continue. And no, in terms of whether they're going to share in any of this rebate, the answer is staff's recommendation is that this accumulated citation revenue surplus be rebated to the general fund.
Okay, proceed, Bob.
Okay, thank you. The next item is a relatively small one. As you know, the city provides the Santa Barbara Conference and Visitors Bureau with a substantial amount of financial cash support each year. They do an excellent job, as we all know, in promoting the city as a destination. But we had included, when we adopted the 2-year financial plan, a 3% CPI in the second year for our contribution to them, and we are recommending reducing that CPI from 3% to 2%, which saves $16,172.
Well, that's another example which follows along with what Ms. Falcone was saying, and one we may want to take a look at later on, in the sense that the outcome of that body is to generate revenue for the city. So maybe it's not a wise thing to do, but
Well, have
I
we
don't
heard
want to
from-
go there right now.
Have we heard from CVB about this?
I notified Kathy Janega Dykes about this about 2 months ago, and she seemed to understand. And I mean, I think with Kathy, she would always prefer more, but didn't register any strong objections to it. We've talked several times since.
Okay. I will, going back to the street sweeping, this $500,000 is a one-time rebate, which is fine. Moving forward, and maybe that's a year from now as we look into the next 2-year financial plan, to look at that combination of general fund and Measure B funds to pay for this and how it's working, especially if we'll have the rest of the last phase in place starting July 1st. Because if the citations themselves can pay for the program, why have Measure B funds pay for the program? And I'll just put in a plug now. I'm going to be asking about signage when that issue comes to council in May for an update, especially on the east side and west side. But that's not for today, but that's just a heads up. Thanks.
And I just, because you'll see this on the police department, there's one other adjustment we're making related to street sweeping, and that is we were not assessing the street sweeping program for any of the business functions in the police department, like the business office or the supervision of the parking enforcement operators. And so we're also proposing in one of the police adjustments that comes up to that $700,000 is to actually give them that revenue to offset what we believe is the true cost of issuing those citations. And then our expectation is at the end of next year, we think we're in equilibrium. And if we are have citation revenue in excess of that, then I think it would be appropriate to then say we shouldn't charge the Creeks Fund for more than they really need.
Okay, time is fleeing.
Time is. The last item on this list is savings of $75,000 from a recommended minor reduction in ongoing capital projects. And I think you will recall that we looked at the capital project list from last time, and thank you, Bob. And there were two capital projects. One was the Front County Trails Plan, and one was the Parma Park staging area that that is on page B19 under Financial Summary tab. And it's near the bottom of page 19. You'll see the last two general fund capital projects. There you go. You see that the way that schedule is laid out, it's the capital project, proposed capital budget for next fiscal year for the general fund. And there were two projects that had been originally in the 2-year plan, and those are the two I just mentioned, Parma Park Staging Area and the Front Country Trails Plan, which we're proposing to defer. And Parks and Recreation, as I recall, is actually supportive of that because they think from a workload perspective that actually fits their plans even better. But then the other piece is, yeah, they were both grant funded. The other two that we're proposing, the $75,000, one is a reduction from $250,000 to $200,000 in our sort of ADA improvements pot of money, and a reduction from $125,000 to $100,000 in our sustainability improvements money. And I know that this was pointed out by more than one of you, I think, last time, at least one of you, that this should not be construed as reducing the city's commitment to either of these things, because actually, frankly, the bulk of the city's money in these kinds of things, and particularly in ADA, are built into discrete projects and building maintenance activities. This is almost like an extra pot of money that we use to take on things that come up through the year. And so in no way should anybody construe from this that either, A, that this is the extent of our financial commitment to these two worthy projects, you know, and that, or that these are percentage cuts in those that would seem like they're a large percentage, because they're really not.
Jim, is our infrastructure task force likely to have some comments or recommendations that could impact on capital spending?
I don't believe next fiscal year, but in the outgoing years, I think they will. I hope that they will, because I think they're going to deal with how we finance these. And I just wanted to add to what Mr. Pearson said. We just added these two projects in fiscal year 08, and so before we had no general fund money going to either of these categories. So although we're reducing it slightly, I think it still shows a major new investment into both ADA improvements and general fund sustainability improvements that we had never had before. So that's the only way we kind of felt comfortable with this.
Yeah.
On those two, we don't itemize what exactly they're for. So that is just on hold unless something comes up during the year that we can allocate $200,000 in ADA and $100,000 in sustainability. It's not.
Quite honestly, when we put this together last year, those were just numbers that we put in the budget to start applying towards that. And I don't think we still identified projects even for this year. So we will identify.
So what happened to that funding?
It will stay there.
Stay there?
It will be.
So does that really mean in terms of funds available, it's 200 plus 250? And
yeah, I don't know if we.
The library ADA
the
is going to be
library.
part of the ADA one. So that's that project for this year.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. That wasn't separate. That wasn't a separate accounted for in the capital, because it was a separate.
Right.
Okay. So it just allows us during the fiscal year for something to come to council to say, here's a new project that came up
Exactly.
and here's the funding available. Okay. And then, Bob, can you, back on the Front Country Trails Plan and the Parma Park, I didn't quite catch. This is funding that was grant funded, but we're deferring it a year, which saves us Park and Rec staff time. Is that what can you repeat what you said? Because it's not a general fund savings, because the funding is either grant funded for the Front Country Trails Plan or through the Parma Park Trust for Parma Park.
Right, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Schneider. No, I think it wasn't meant as a cost savings item. It was strictly a workload related issue.
Okay, all right. So
for
it's
the
not
Parks and
related
Rec.
to the budget reallocation. It's just related to what actually is going to get done next fiscal year.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
On that, Mr. Chair?
Please.
Not so much for the Parma Park staging, because that comes out of the Parma Park Trust, but the grant funding for the Front Country Trails Plan. Say that 3 times fast. Are we in any danger of losing that grant funding? In other words, there are timelines very often associated with grants, and I'm wondering whether or not, because there has been a multi-jurisdictional task force that has been working very, very hard on the shared use of the Front Country Trails, and if maintenance or enhancements are part of that work, I'm wondering, A, are we in danger of losing the grant funding at all? And B, does it mess with their work, this multi-jurisdictional group?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Falcone, no. My understanding, my recollection is, and we will certainly get you confirmation of this, is that in part is that there's still, you note that it says that it's the second year of a 2-year project, that they're still actually working on spending the remaining amounts from the year one. And that this is simply a timing thing and that there is no risk because of this action of losing any second year grant funding.
I believe we haven't yet secured a grant. This was hoping to get a grant, and so that we're not jeopardizing any grant. We just haven't. They were doing the first part of bringing everybody together and trying to get consensus, and we're coming to you, I think, in a couple of weeks at council on that, and then they're going to try and secure grant funding. But we're not there yet, so this is not where we're going to lose a grant.
Okay. Further questions on that one? Let's move along.
Well, we're now finished with that schedule, so I think in the time we have left, what I would like to go over, I had actually a couple schedules, and I don't know that we're going to get to them all today, which is fine because we're, as you know, at the beginning of the process. So there's 2 pages for each of you, and yes, please, Mr. Samaria will put that up on the screen for us. And what this is a schedule that essentially was taken right out of the budget document. In fact, if you go to your budget document, you will see this schedule. It's a summary of operating appropriations by fund. And what we wanted to show you, we took the schedule out of the budget document and we added a column to it. Other than that, it's essentially, not essentially, it's identical. We added 2 columns. We added the 2 outside columns to be specific. We added in the first column, fiscal year 2008 adopted, which is, as you know, the current fiscal year. And that column represents the originally adopted budget for the current fiscal year. And then on the far side, the right-hand side, we added a percentage change column, which I will explain what that is intended to represent. One more page. What we wanted to show you here is that give you an idea of the change in the general fund departmental budgets, and actually we've given you all of the citywide operating budgets here, but the focus today is on the general fund, to compare the recommended fiscal year 09 budget that you're now considering, and to compare by department those numbers to the adopted current year budget. And so, as an example, if we look at the first general fund department, we see administrative services, and the current fiscal year's originally adopted budget was some $2.3 million, and that the recommended budget for next year is $2.1 million, and that's a decrease of 8.8%. So I just, as an example of how I would read the schedule and to try to draw your attention to the additional information that we added to the schedule, which we hope you would find helpful. And you can see as we go down this schedule in the green, which is the departmental totals, that there is quite a bit of variability between the departments, and we're going to be prepared at a future meeting soon, perhaps next week, to explain to you in some detail what was driving the numbers, the changes from one year to the next on a department-by-department basis. So I was going to briefly go through the departments.
Well, while you're on that example, and you have it up here, there's FY 2008 adopted,
right,
2.3 plus, and then FY 09 proposed, 2.185.
Right.
Then the second to the last column on the right is FY 09 recommended, which is 2.157. Now, you have mid-cycle adjustments of $27,000. You pointed us toward the 2008 adopted and the 2009 proposed. How does the 2009 recommended come in? Because the 8.8 differential is between the 2008 and the 2009 proposed.
No, 2009 recommended.
It's now between the 2009 recommended.
Right.
So are we leaping from the 2008 adopted to the 2009 recommended and basically looking at 2009 proposed as
Well, let me
just for grins and giggles?
No, I don't think so. And
Tell us how we are going to,
Yes.
and what does 8.8 and 27,000, 8.8% and 27,000 actually refer to?
I will do that.
Thank you.
If we start with the columns from the left, as I mentioned, the first column is the FY08 current year originally adopted budget. The second column, which is titled FY 2009 proposed plan, was the second year of the two-year financial plan at the time it was adopted. So it's where we started when we dusted off the second year and began what we refer to as our mid-cycle review. So if we had made no adjustments to what was contained in the two-year financial plan, that would have been the FY09 budget. The next column is called approved adjustments to date, and you'll note that in administrative services there are none, but we'll get to some of the departments that did have something in that column. The next one is the column is the mid-cycle adjustments. Now, mid-cycle adjustments really is a combination of two series of numbers. The first of them is that when we dust off year two of the two-year financial plan, we rerun our payroll forecasts and the like, and invariably that results in changes to what was in the second year of the two-year plan, just because of people have come and gone, personnel has turned over, different people have gotten promotions, raises, transfers, and we reforecast payroll, salary, and benefits to reflect the current status of our workforce a year later. And there are invariably changes that results in, and in fact, that's going to be one of my points as we get a little later on. What we have found on a regular basis over the last 5 or 6 years is when we do that mid-cycle reforecast of our salary and benefit costs, they invariably go down all by themselves.
Sure.
So that has nothing to do for the public's benefit. That has nothing, the 27,000 in this case on the first line where the pen is pointing, has nothing to do with cuts. It
No.
has to do with internal adjustments that happen as a matter of course through the year as just a function of doing business.
That's partly true, because as I mentioned, and probably didn't say with enough emphasis, is that mid-cycle adjustments column represents a combination of two factors, one of which is what you just exactly correctly described, which is the normal rebudgeting drift that we see that reflects absolutely no impact on services, service levels, or anything like that. But this column also includes the recommended, staff recommended budget adjustments that you have seen presented to you on a separate schedule. And so that column that we've titled here mid-cycle adjustments is really a combination of those two things. And this is what I think it's important that we will bring you, hopefully next week, the breakout between those two items so that you will be able to see the portion of the change that is represented by the normal shift, the normal sort of rebudgeting that things just change, and the discretionary recommended budget adjustments, and split those out. And I think an example that might be of interest to you, and I'll just sort of anecdotally mention this even though it's a bit out of sequence, is in the police department, the management recommended adjustments to the police department are some $700,000+. But if you look at this schedule, their budget's going down $1.2 million. The difference between those is about $450,000. And I can tell you that when we reforecast our labor costs, salary and benefits, in the police department, salaries alone went down $220,000 because of turnover. Keep in mind that when you have a step 5, a top-of-the-range employee leave and gets replaced by an entry-level person, in salary alone, that's a 20% savings. When you factor in all the benefits, and remember that PERS is almost a 40% of salary cost, you're up to a reduction of 35 to 38 to 39% per position. And so if you just have 10 positions turn over in the police department, you're easily talking, you know, $300,000, $350,000, even as much as $400,000 change to the better in the budget, simply because of the impact of turnover.
Because a lieutenant is retiring and he's being replaced by a rookie line officer.
No, because a 30-year veteran line officer is retiring and being replaced by a rookie.
By a rookie, okay.
Yes.
Yep.
But somebody senior is being replaced by a rookie.
That's correct.
And the problem with our payroll forecast model is it doesn't make assumptions about turnover. It assumes that everybody that is with us will stay with us and continue to get raises, and that's the glitch in the system. And you know, citywide, it's maybe half of 1%, or 1%, but when you total it over the whole budget, it starts to be real money.
Now,
I don't think that's a glitch. I think that's, I mean, you don't want to under budget for people if they're staying for the whole year. I mean,
No, but it's just one of those things.
I wouldn't necessarily call it a glitch.
No, it's not a perfect model, and it predicts within about a half of 1%. But what we found, and we've just really kind of been, as we've tried to slice this budget tighter, we've realized that it does this every year, and so that we in fact we kind of almost start to factor it in, say, okay, the payroll forecast model is going to, when we do it again, we're going to get some savings there.
Yeah.
Yeah, my point is that this is the first budget that is really being forecast and televised for the public. No matter how many of the multi-bazillions are watching out there, even if it's only for 4 or 5 people who really care about it, this is the first time that we're going over it in this detail. It's always been televised at council level, but that's in the macro sort of sense, and you don't get into the details of exactly how you parse out this money. And if you don't understand what the formulas are that go into the various calculations, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to follow. Although we may be familiar with it, most people out there are not. So to go over it in a little bit of exaggerated detail, I think, is only helpful, especially since it's the first time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, and I will continue to appreciate you reminding me of that. I'm serious because, you know, we have, the finance folks have the trouble just, you know, we live and breathe it, and sometimes it's hard for us to remember that not everyone does the same. So we appreciate the reminders. Right. Just on a logistics note, Mr. Chair, you know, we're going to continue until, you know, we're not going to get through everything we had planned to get through today, and we're going to have time in the future, starting again, obviously, next week, to continue this discussion. So we're prepared to wrap this up at any point you would like, because I know, obviously, you know.
Okay, well, I think we need to leave 15, 20 minutes for us to get back up on the hill and pick up our other books and things like that.
Can I ask one just last question about the columns, Mr. Chair?
Please.
I don't think, Mr. Pearson, that you actually finished getting through all the columns. Maybe if we could do that in its completion and then wrap up, if that's all right with you,
works.
Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely. So we talked about the mid-cycle adjustments column and how it's a combination of 2 separate things, and how we will bring you the breakout of those 2 separate things so that you'll be able to see the impacts of the 2 of them on a discrete basis. The next to last column is entitled FY 2009 Recommended, and that is the budget that you are reviewing at this point. And then the last column is a percent change, and what we wanted to show you here was something that wasn't contained in the budget book, and that is, how does the budget that you are considering, the recommended budget for next year that you're considering, how does that compare on a department by department and program by program basis to the adopted current year budget that was adopted last June? And so that you can see, because I think our point is in large measure is that while we tend to focus on the task at hand, which is balancing the budget, and that, of course, then brings us to focusing on the recommended adjustments, which, of course, you know, are reductions, and that tends to become the focus. I think it's helpful to remember that even in spite of those decisions that are before us, for the most part, the budgets are still going up. The proposed fiscal year 09 budgets are more, in most cases, not all, are more than the budgets that were adopted for the current fiscal year. So even though we're reducing budgets, we are only reducing essentially the rate of growth, not actually reducing it. Now,
That's a key point, and I think that other cities have not experienced as good a revenue picture as we have, and so they're seeing actual decreases in revenue.
absolutely.
In the same time that there's a pressure for them to increase because of automatic salary adjustments. So in that sense, we have a little bit better picture than some other cities do in the state of California.
Right, and I would just, I don't plan to go through them now because I think that we got through the columns and we can come back to the substance next time. But if you just look at the percent change on a department by department basis, you will see that what I was referring to, which is that. Yes. Well, the first one is administrative services, and just because that is a fairly large negative number, as I recall, it's the election costs that are discrete and that we don't have any municipal elections scheduled in FY09.
Really?
June 30, 09. Yeah, because it's November of 09, which will be fiscal year 2010. That's scary.
And that would change if an initiative qualified, or if we do the utility users tax, we'd have to supplement this.
Well, but wouldn't that be, it would be through the county, though,
Yeah, it would
this
be
year.
much- it
So it would be
wouldn't-
much,
we would
much less than
consolidate
what
with
we
the
would
county,
normally
yeah.
see consolidate. So just to close the loop on that final piece of it with the percentages for people who are looking, it's by department based on FY08 adopted, which makes sense that administrative services is down by 8.8% because we're not running an election this year like we did last year. But if you look at the bottom line on the general fund is still growing by 4.3%. And in fact, a lot of the different general fund departments are growing. For example, police is still growing by 1.7% and fire by 8.4%, because since we've been talking about public safety, it's just the adjustments we're making mid-year is that we projected them to even grow even more than we thought, and now we just have, so it's just not growing as much.
That's correct, and I don't say that in any way to minimize the. Yeah, but I think it's true that we tend to focus and lose maybe the picture that hey, we're talking about growing budgets, we're just not talking about them growing
Right.
as much
Rate
as
of
that
growth.
we had planned to, or maybe even hoped to.
Okay. You want to call it quits here today, then? or-
That would be
Do we need
acceptable.
to look at these dates and approve them?
Oh, goodness gracious. Thank you. Yes is the answer. We had in your packet, there was a review schedule, which, as you know, last week we brought you a list of topics that we were recommending you look at and asked if you had any other topics that you wanted to add to the list, and you did. Oh, good idea, Bob. And so what we have before you is a review schedule. Now, I think that this is a guideline, and I'll give you an example. Today, we didn't get through everything that we wanted to, so undoubtedly we will pick up next time where we left off this time. But for the most part, we hope to hold to that schedule. We may have some little bit of spillover from one week to the next to finish up a particular topic, but we would like you to approve that review schedule or amend it further if you think we haven't captured your direction.
Right. No. So we'd like to make a motion on that effect?
Well, Mr. Chair, I'd like to note that on Tuesday, May 6th, with Community Development Fees and Revenues, I will be out of town on that date. That was been a long-standing, well-known departure for that date. And I'm okay with making my comments aside for community development fees and revenues, but I would hope that if there is some sort of pour-over from the general fund discussion, that would be deferred until the May 13th so that I could actively participate in that. I'm good with making my comments on community development, but I would like to be physically present and actively involved in any of the other discussions, if that is
Sounds
all
good.
right with the board.
We'll make sure that happens.
Absolutely, we can make sure that
I
happens.
appreciate
Great.
it. I'll make a motion to approve the schedule with that
Second.
Second.
caveat.
All those
Thank
in
you.
favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. All right. Well, then, that being the case, we'll adjourn the Finance Committee meeting for today, and we'll see everybody same time next week.
Thank you very much.